Well, I'll be talking about sexual harassment in academia. Universities are complex systems of our society. They are institutions with very harsh structures, keeping silence about things that happen inside as a spirit of the normal way of doing. We also know that sexual harassment exists in academia, both based on power, like a student-professor relationship, or between professors from different power positions, and also the student harassment, so the peer harassment. The data shows that 1 in 5, or about 20% of students, especially women in academia, have suffered some kind of sexual harassment during their time in college or working there. So it's safe to say that sexual harassment in academia is based on power and silence. The literature we used to call it the law of silence, meaning something that everyone knows that happened, or it's happening, but nobody talks about it. Even less, nobody dares to do something about it, mainly because of fear of reprisals and so on. But we will come back to this later. So during the 70s and the mid 70s, I will say, in the United States, some students started to raise their voices against sexual harassment in academia. Also, the Title IX legislation was approved at the beginning of the 70s, which is still used actually as a basis for complaints against sexual harassment. So there were some movements such as classes on gender studies, so some talk begins at the University of Yale, but it was in 1978 when the WASH, Women Organized Against Sexual Harassment Group, was created at the University of Berkeley in California. So in 1979, we had the first complaint against sexual harassment that we know about. That was at the, as I said, University of California, Berkeley. During the 80s, they elaborated the first policies and mechanisms to deal with these issues in universities. That was a very pioneering thing. Nobody else had this kind of protocols, units for equality, offices dedicated to assure that all these policies are being implemented. And during the 90s, they started assessing these policies and their implementation and starting to publish about it, different scholars. Even some of these scholars published about the fear of complaint and the lack of support for the survivors who wanted to complain. So, this is how we get to the concept of SOS, second order of sexual harassment. In this context, the concept emerged to explain that direct survivors were suffering from reprisals and negative consequences for complaining, but not only the direct survivors themselves were experiencing these negative consequences, but also these people who decided to help survivors in their journey going forward. This is how the second order of sexual harassment concept emerged, to explain that helping survivors, even if you are not a direct survivor yourself, may lead you to reprisals, negative consequences, comments against you or your loved ones, even not being able to do research appropriately or not being included in committees and so on. In academia works like that. So this is the way how power is kept in academia, right? Um, so this is how the second order of sexual harassment is defined. And even if you are not a direct survivor, as I say, you may become one by supporting others. Protecting these potential survivors is important, as the lack of support may be a limitation for direct survivors to complain. Yeah. So the concept of SOS was introduced in Spain in 2016 to explain the Spanish context of the first complaint we know about, which started in 2011 in Spain. Due to some limitations of the concept of SOS, the new name has been elaborating, conducting research, interviewing people, and so on. So the new name is isolating gender violence, as the main aim of those who commit these reprisals against survivors are to isolate these survivors and have them keeping the silence about their experience. This second order of sexual harassment concept, or the isolating gender violence concept, however you want to call him, has been legislated in the Spanish context. We have several autonomous communities in Spain, and in three of them, Catalonia, the Basque Country, and La Rioja, has been included in the legislation against sexual harassment. So the idea was to broaden the concept of supporting direct survivors and supporting also who became survivor because of helping the direct survivors. So, speaking more broadly about collective action and institutional change, I'd like to mention that I was myself part of the creation of the Solidarity Network of Victims of Gender Violence in Universities. That was in 2013. So, as I mentioned before, we had the first complaint in Spain in 2011, that was the University of Barcelona, and 2 years later, we created the Solidarity Network. How this happened? So we were 14 survivors that we did all the process, the 2 years process, the internal process within the university, and then the external process with the state attorney and so on. And at the end of the process, we came together and we joined our forces and we were like, what we should do to help others, right? And we decided to create the Solidarity Network. But the idea of helping others was not only to support them or to listen them and believe them regarding the harassment experience they had in academia. It was to protect them from the response that the university had to our case, right? Because we experienced all the reprisals that everyone can imagine. We were excluded from committees and so on. So so that was a very hard moment for us, right? And being alone in that situation when the power, no, the university is taking the harasser side, it's actually very bad for the survivors themselves. So joining and being part of a solidarity network help survivors thrive. Long story short, we realized, and also conducting research, I did myself the dissertation on this topic. We came up with the idea that the solidarity networks were not only useful and necessary to listen, believe, support, as I say, survivors in academia, but also to press institutions to change. Because universities started to fear the social movement and the student movement, especially. Student movements usually are very active in academia, but they were not regarding sexual harassment because they had a fear against it, to fight against it, right? So when they dare to join demonstrations and to have flyers and write everywhere in the university that sexual harassment should stop, so is when universities started to create protocols, implement measures, and at least try to do something about this topic. So, of course, the structural change is possible because of the grassroots movement of the students from below and all these massive people also who support these students and activists, because they were not only survivors, they were also activists supporting other survivors and being in solidarity with them. So, even if harassment is different in the university context and in society in general, universities had always an important role model, I will say, to influence society and other educational organizations. One example of this is the bystander intervention program, which started in universities in the US and was later conducted in schools or even in companies. We have now this programming being implemented in different countries all around the world. The same happened with the protocols against harassment. They started in universities, and nowadays many companies companies, or almost all of them, um, have currently at least a protocol against harassment, but they also have training and also all other mechanisms and measures to support bullying and mobbing and other situations that we know may happen also in the company context, which is kind of similar with the academy, as it's based on power and silence and so on. So as for actions that universities should implement, I will say that we need formal and informal mechanisms. Of course, we need the formal mechanisms, the protocols, offices, but also the informal mechanisms, the students, the peers who will help, support, and believe survivors. Also, we should empower survivors to speak up and create support centers. In general, these centers have shown very, very huge impact on survivors' well-being in general. Um, Universities should always take survivor side, of course, which will benefit academia and science in general, because dropping out is one of the main consequences of suffering harassment and gender-based violence in academia. So universities should avoid losing this talent. I also like to say that we are in the better moment, the best moment, I will say, in academia. We are progressing very much during the last years and decades. So the future is positive, and I'm confident that we are implementing even more and more policies and mechanisms supporting survivors, and also creating this general thinking of believing them, and knowing that they are the people we need in academia, and this kind of behaviors shouldn't be happening in our universities.